Welcome to the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast, XFL DFS Week 3 edition. We're here to recap some Week 2 player usage, look at some role changes, and then we'll bring you a first look at some Week 3 XFL DFS picks, lineup strategies, and advice for FanDuel and DraftKings. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, joined as always by Chris Rooney, our XFL Daily Plug writer. What's up, Chris?
Brian, what's going on, man?
Not a lot. You and I were talking before we started recording and said that it's been a long 4 days since XFL. We were a little burned out on Monday, and now we're ready. We're ready to go.
Yeah, exactly.
So
looking forward to some more XFL games here. I think the beginning of last weekend was pretty tough, but the games on Sunday, honestly, I think they kind of lit the fire under me again. They were pretty exciting. We'll talk about this in depth, but these games have been pretty tough to watch at times. But I think we keep in mind the fact that some of these teams didn't really have, the quote-unquote preseason that NFL teams get. They're kind of playing into who they want to be, figuring out their identities, and I think now that we're into Week 3, hopefully the quality picks up a little bit.
yeah, that's definitely true, and maybe even with some of these quarterbacks getting back into the mix, Josh Johnson, Landry Jones, we'll get better quarterback play in the weeks to follow. So if you're listening to this is, again, Week 3 XFL DFS. First, in this episode, we're going to take a look at a recap from Week 2. There was quite a bit of role changes from the first week of the XFL season, so we'll discuss those guys. We'll talk about our DFS approach after 2 weeks. We have data, we have some contests, some lineup constructions to look through. We'll talk about how our strategies may be changing based on what we've seen so far. And then we'll look ahead to this weekend's game, Week 3, and we'll talk about the games from the betting market perspective, spread sides and totals, and then a long list of injuries to monitor for this upcoming week. So Chris, let's start it off. Let's talk about last week's Week 2 games and some of the big role changes that we saw. And we actually picked up on this late, right before the slate started on Saturday. And not saying you should trust social media all the time, but when an official team account tweets out a guy 3 different times the hour before the game starts, like the DC Defenders did with DeAndre Tompkins, it's signaled that he may be in for a pretty big role in that first game back.
Yeah, for sure. Malachi Dupree obviously was the receiver in that receiving room that really was affected the most by Tompkins' return. He basically played almost every snap, every passing snap, I should say, in Week 1, and dropped down to about, looks like somewhere in the neighborhood of 30%-ish in Week 2. And a lot of that is definitely because Tompkins was in the mix, got a ton of targets early from Cardale Jones. So it seems like that's who they want to use here over Dupree. It is Tompkins. Looks like 27 routes in Week 2 versus just 12 for Dupree. So looking like as long as Tompkins and the others at the top of the depth chart here, Eli Rogers, Rashad Ross, stay healthy, those are going to be the 3 guys here.
Yep, and again, we're getting this route data from Pro Football Focus. So if you're interested in the route and snap data, that's where you can head over profootballfocus.com or pff.com. All right, let's talk about Dallas. Chris, one of the guys that we were high on after their Week 1 opportunity was Gerard Hurd, former college quarterback. He fell to just 10 snaps in Week 2, where Josh Crockett took over and played 53 snaps for Dallas. I think, as we talked about even in this episode last week, that Dallas is going to be tough to predict outside of those primary guys like Jeff Badette, Donald Parham, just because they rotate so many receivers into that mix.
Right. Yeah, the Crockett's role really came out of nowhere, and it just makes me wonder, was he always a part of the plan? Was he a little banged up in Week 1? I mean, we had severe lack of reporting, at least that we saw going into Week 1. Yeah. So Crockett seems to be someone we probably need to pay more attention to. Another player that I flagged for us to kind of just briefly discuss here is Flynn Nagel. He ran a route on basically almost every pass attempt for the Renegades in Week 2. Didn't do much with it. He wasn't near the top of your fantasy leaderboards or anything like that. But of all the receivers for Dallas, he actually played the most in Week 2, which is interesting.
Yeah, it definitely is. And also something to keep in mind, if you weren't watching the games and you're just looking at snap counts and routes run, Jeff Badette was injured on the very first play of the game, missed a few series and did come back. So that's why his involvement numbers are a little depressed. So just something to keep in mind. All right, these New York Guardians, a situation that we're going to continue to target over the coming weeks. We feel like there's opportunity to be made here. Like you and I were talking earlier today, they just can't get enough snaps on offense. Mikhail McKay, lead dog, their number one receiver. But there was a little bit of change in week 2 with some of these secondary guys, Joe Horn, Colby Pearson. Their number 4 and 5 receivers got a little bit of run. So what are we thinking here?
Yeah, I wonder if week 1 and week 2, I guess, is more of a case of there's just there's such a smaller sample of plays that the Guardians have run. They've only had like 45-ish plays per game so far, largely because they've just been really inept on offense. So, we liked Joe Horn a lot as kind of a value play in week 2 because of his week 1 role, but now he is kind of a part-time player. Same with Colby Pearson, who had a ton of air yards in week 1, kind of a part-time player in week 2, with Teo Redding obviously seeing the biggest boost. And Austin Duke, who was someone that we were actually pretty high on in week 1 because of the way he was listed on the depth chart, actually did play more here in week 2. So, other than McKay, this is actually a really tough situation to forecast. As huge underdogs against St. Louis here in week 3, I guess maybe we need to look at this New York passing game as a whole a little closer, because that implies they'll be playing in a trailing game script here and they'll need to pass more. But it's really hard to feel comfortable with anybody but McKay here.
Yeah, McKay we love. He's getting a ton of air yards so far. Joe Horn actually is dealing with a shoulder injury, and that may be the reason he didn't play 100% of the snaps. He didn't practice as of Wednesday. We are recording this Thursday late afternoon, so something to keep an eye on through the weekend's games. Seattle, Austin Proehl, huge 2-touchdown game in week 1. He ran just the third most routes for Seattle in week 2. Now, granted, it was a pretty close game script, and they were leading or within one score pretty much the entire contest. And he is their slot guy, so maybe it has something to do with that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they also only threw like 18 passes, I think, in this game, so just not a huge volume of passing plays. So got to keep that in mind with Proehl. He was kind of a good candidate to fade in week 2 anyway, coming off of a big game in week 1. So kind of worked out if that's what you did, I guess. But the receiver for Seattle that really kind of stands out still is Keenan Reynolds. Played almost every snap in both of these 2 games. So with Proehl taking a little bit of a step back in week 2, it looks like Casey Williams still banged up. Some other issues here with the Seattle wide receiver core. Reynolds seems to be solidified as the guy we should be keying on with the Dragons here.
Yeah, tons of targets, tons of air yards. Still, actually, despite his long touchdown last week, still underperforming his opportunity by a little bit. So, a guy we really like here heading into week 3. Let's see. Let's actually head over to DC again. We talked about the wide receiver situation, DeAndre Thompkins, Malachi Dupree. Last week, leading up to the week 2 games, they made a switch on the running back depth chart. Donnell Pumphrey was listed as number 1. Jarrell Presley listed as number 2. That was a switch from week 1, how they were ordered. And the depth chart didn't lie. Pumphrey played 35 snaps. Presley played 27. I know that you're still not convinced that this is going to continue. You know that Presley is a much more talented running back.
Yeah, he seems to be pretty elusive, breaking more tackles than Pumphrey based off of some of that PFF data that we've looked at. So, this may be a timeshare thing. Pumphrey seems to be a little more dynamic, specifically in the passing game for them. And Cardell Jones obviously is probably their best asset on their offense. So maybe that has a lot to do with why Pumphrey was elevated on the depth chart. But, when they need to grind out a game, maybe run the football a little bit more, it just feels to me like Presley might be the guy that has more of that role. And, we just have not really seen, outside of Cameron Artis-Payne, I guess, this past weekend for Dallas, a big running back games in the XFL yet. Presley, to me, seems like the type of guy that can do that on the ground. So I'm still going to be chasing that personally, but I'm not going to begrudge anyone for going after Pumphrey here because he's playing pretty well as well.
Yep, for sure. And you mentioned Cameron Artis-Payne, and obviously had a huge game this past week. I think he's in line for a fade candidate here in week 3, as both of his touchdowns came, I don't know if it was outside the red zone, but definitely outside the 10-yard line. He's still splitting work with Lance Dunbar. However, the one thing that changed from week 1 to week 2, and I'm not saying this is the case, but I did suggest it last week that maybe some of these teams are still waiting for these running backs to get in full game shape. Dallas's number 3 and number 4 running backs, Marquise Young, Austin Walter, they combined for 29 snaps in week 1. They combined for just 4 last week. So lots of more opportunity for both Dunbar and Artis-Payne if that continues to hold.
Yeah, definitely something that we want to keep an eye on there. With Dunbar also, just seeing a ton of targets in this air raid offense for Dallas, more than Cameron Artis-Payne has been seeing. So something else to keep in mind as far as If you're thinking about chasing the production of Cameron Artis-Payne, that may be something that burns you in the end, if that makes sense. Dunbar's playing a lot for them.
Yep, for sure. Let's go down to Tampa Bay. Their running back situation, only team in the league with 2 running backs over 100 yards rushing through 2 weeks. That's Jock Patrick, De'Veon Smith. De'Veon was the lead back in week 1. However, Patrick literally played the same exact amount of snaps as De'Veon Smith here in week 2, and he looked a lot better doing it in my eyes, on his 37 snaps. And people may not know, Jock Patrick actually leads the XFL from a skill position standpoint in goal line opportunities. So a little bit of mispricing as we head into here to week 3.
Yeah, and these goal line opportunities are something I think we're going to need to start keying in on, especially when we consider there just has not been a lot of rushing touchdown production from the running back position. That feels like that has to normalize at some point. There's only been 5 rushing touchdowns by running backs across the entire XFL in 2 weeks. That's 8 total games. I have a feeling that if you look at some NFL data, the average number would be a little higher than that.
Yeah.
So it definitely feels like Patrick is probably someone that has kind of leaped ahead of Smith just as far as production is concerned here. And with those opportunities, he could be somebody that starts to score week in and week out on a team, by the way, that is actually still looking for their first offensive touchdown. So maybe he's the best bet for that.
Yeah, they're 0 for about 60 in the red zone so far this season. So hopefully, just based on regression alone, they're going to score some points here pretty shortly. All right, last role change to discuss before we talk about some DFS aspects for the week 3 slate. Christine Michael, Matt Jones. Now, this may be an injury-induced situation or role change, but Chris, what are your thoughts? So last week, Christian Michael played 43 snaps. Matt Jones played 38 snaps. Matt Jones came into the game on the injury report, limited in practice most of the days. I think he got banged up a little bit in the game, and this was a big reversal from week 1 where Jones dominated opportunity.
Yeah, no, I believe going into this week 2 game that Jones flashed on the injury report as limited with a knee issue and looked like he may have aggravated that at some point during the game. To be fair, I'm not entirely sure what the specific injury situation in game was for him, but he did rotate out for quite an extended period of time, and Michael got a lot of work.
By the way, we'll never find out what the injury was based on XFL reporting.
Based on the way they're reporting things, that's totally fair to suggest. But the one takeaway that I had from Christine Michael, we talked about this earlier today, actually offline. Michael had a generational run where he basically reversed field and gained 0 yards. It looks like St. Louis, though, seriously is committed to running the football. So whoever out of these 2 is on the field, they're a good bet to get a lot of touches and a good bet to produce fantasy points in an offense that wants to run the football. If Jones is unable to practice, and it is Thursday night here, they play. I think they play on Sunday, right?
Yep.
If Jones is limited in any way, Michael at his price for DFS becomes someone that we really want to focus on, with St. Louis is such a huge favorite here against the Guardians.
Yeah, unless Matt Jones is fully practicing the next 2 days, Thursday and Friday, Michael's going to be one of my favorite plays. Like I said, we talked about this pretty extensively offline, and you'll certainly find that in the Daily Plug. Now, you, I, Lucas, we're the 3 contributors for the XFL Daily Plug. That's OccupyFantasy.com. All of our thoughts for every slate goes into that Daily Plug. We rank the top plays. We give you some leverage spots. We give team-by-team notes. And then we talk about how to approach the slate from a lineup construction standpoint, what types of contests to play. So we're always having these types of conversations to get ourselves ready to write the plug. So now we have 2 weeks of data for the XFL. Let's talk about this from a DFS perspective. So we've seen, at least on DraftKings, because we're able to get the data, FanDuel still doesn't have the ability to download contest CSVs. But in the 2 big DraftKings GPPs, the 4-game slates, both winners, 4 wide receivers in their lineup, the top 0.1% of the field, 4 wide receivers in their lineups, much more heavily than the rest of the field. What are your thoughts here? What are we thinking? Sample size, lineup construction, all this information that we've got so far.
Yeah, so the top level players here have been flexing 2 wide receivers is really what you're saying, to state it a different way for the listeners here, right? And I guess the only thing that I'm kind of leery about here is I wonder if this is just, collectively, are we going to fall into the trap of results-oriented thinking here? I talked a little bit about how there hasn't been a lot of running back production for fantasy in the XFL so far. So kind of makes sense that playing 4 wide receivers in your DraftKings lineups has been the winning formula for tournament players so far through just 2 weeks of action. I have a feeling that if we see a few more running back touchdowns across the league, you'll start to see those running backs in that flex position in the first place lineup on DraftKings. But it's really hard to deny through 8 games that this has been a league where passing production has just outpaced the rushing production. Obviously, it doesn't take as many opportunities for receivers to quote unquote break the slate and find their way into the winning lineups. So, I must say I'm pretty heavily considering restricting my lineup builds to using wide receivers in the flex here, unless there's a really attractive running back opportunity like we have potentially with St. Louis this week, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And on DraftKings, in NFL, we talked about it where, especially in tournaments, the high upside, the PPR scoring, receivers and flex is generally the way to go. Now with 2 flex spots here in the XFL, it does make sense that the scoring is skewing more towards wide receivers. But the field is catching up on this as well, and they were pretty quick to learn after week 1. So looking at the big DraftKings GPP, 42% of the field, it was like 41,000 entrants, just 42% of the entrants had 4 wide receivers in their lineups. They had just 1 running back, flex 2 receivers. The quote-unquote winners, the top 0.1% of that contest, 93% of them had a 4 wide receiver lineup. So a big edge there. We look ahead to week 2, this past weekend's games, the field got pretty smart, but still not smart enough. They jumped up to 70% 4 wide receiver lineups, whereas the top 0.1% had 95%. So, Chris, the field is catching up. Everything you read out there is receiver, receiver, receiver. That number is going to go even higher. But like you, I agree. I think at some point, I don't think a 95% success rate is going to stand for 4 wide receiver lineups.
No, it just can't. That this production for running backs is going to catch up to whatever normal should be in the XFL, and you're going to see that reflected in the winning lineups at some point. But if you haven't been studying the winning lineup data, and this is your first time hearing anyone talk about it, it definitely has given us, at least on my end here, a little more pause, and we definitely are thinking a little bit more about putting receivers in flex. I don't want to say exactly exclusively, but probably leaning heavily that way at this point.
Yeah, probably so. Unless you're making tons of lineups. If you're a normal DFS player or casual player, you're making less than 5 lineups. It's probably smart on DraftKings to just go all receivers until we see something that changes that. Now on FanDuel, different story. Half-point PPR scoring, 2-game slates. Much more likely that a running back can, whether it's luck into or regress into a double-digit fantasy scoring performance. So something to keep an eye on there. I wouldn't be as stringent there. You agree, Chris, on FanDuel?
Yeah, no, for sure. The fact that it's half point per reception versus full point really changes the landscape there.
Okay, good call. All right, before we move ahead to week 3, we did mention the daily plug. That's OccupyFantasy.com, members only. Membership's as low as $6 per week. Again, you get so much information. Not only do you get access to the XFL daily plug, but you get access to every sport that we offer. So in season now, we have NBA, we have MLB spring training coming on Saturday, NHL, and then as MLB regular season kicks off here in a month or so. So lots of action. Every sport is included, OccupyFantasy.com. If you like what we're doing here, whether it's in this podcast or in video format, go ahead and click that subscribe button. That way you get our latest content directly to your feed when it's released. All right, now that read is done, Chris, let's head ahead to week 3. And once again, the sports books could not set the totals low enough, as every total has dropped from its opener in week 3.
Yeah, and we have, I think, 2 games where the total by 3 points or more. Dallas and Seattle, I saw that, and I think I just wrote this down. I'm sorry. Let me pull this up. I think also we have, I don't know why I'm having a brain fart here on you. It's New York and St. Louis as well.
Yep.
Faith in this Guardians offense. Also, probably is sharp enough to realize St. Louis has been running the football the most out of all these teams in neutral I can't say that right now. Neutral situations. I know that posted some of that data on Occupy Fantasy's Twitter feed for people to look at, so definitely check that out if you haven't seen it yet. Yeah, it seems like unders are the way to go. Unders have been hitting over the first 2 weeks quite a bit. I think 6 of the 8 games have hit the under so far. So it's pretty much any game that does not involve Houston. That's pretty much the rule of thumb so far here to keep in mind here as we enter week 3.
Yeah, and that Guardians team total, not only is the total dropped, but the spread has moved in favor of St. Louis. I think it was 7.5 point open, and now it's up to 10. As a result, the Guardians team total has dropped from 18 to 15.25 points. That's NFL preseason-esque team total. So we'll see. We'll be on an island if we're playing those Guardian receivers, Chris. So, all right, let's talk about some injuries. Lots of injuries piling up in the XFL, and I think the most important, I know the most important is Cam Phillips here for Houston.
Yeah.
4 touchdowns through 2 games. Massive game in week 2, running a route nearly 100% of Phillip Walker's dropbacks. He hasn't practiced at all this week, and we got official word that he did not practice on their final practice today, Thursday. They play on Saturday, so this could get tricky quickly.
Yeah, in some respects, what we would normally say here if Phillips was fully healthy is that he's like, I don't want to say an easy fade candidate, but a fade candidate just based off of that outsized production in week 2, the 3 touchdowns. Now with him, DNP, probably tough for him to suit up by Saturday. That edge is not going to be there to avoid Cam Phillips and go with other receivers. People are probably going to be pretty in tune with this if they find out Phillips is out. Now, I just double checked. We do not have out or any reports really on game status just yet as we're recording this, but it's probably a safe bet that Phillips and running back D'Angelo Henderson are probably going to find themselves either extremely limited or on the sidelines here in week 3 because they were unable to practice.
It's so gross. A guy scores 3 touchdowns, and we can't even fade him the next week.
I know.
Super annoying. So, again, yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on that. That'll change the slate dramatically as Phillips, undoubtedly, if he's healthy, would be one of the highest owned players on either FanDuel or DraftKings. In that Houston game, they're facing Tampa. A couple injuries for Tampa. First, tight end Nick Truesdale has not practiced through Wednesday with a knee injury. He wasn't in on the final drive of that game against Seattle, so I'm not sure if this is related to that issue. And then quarterback Aaron Murray still has not practiced. I doubt even a full or limited practice here today on Thursday would get him into the lineup. We expect Taylor Cornelius to start, but Quentin Flowers should get some run, and he has a tricky positional designation this week on one site.
Yeah, so he's listed as a running back on FanDuel, but we still have him at the quarterback position on DraftKings. I don't think, certainly feel free to let me know if you disagree with this here, Brian. I don't think Flowers is playable on DraftKings.
Nope.
Looking in week 2, he only threw 9 passes. Cornelius threw 27. So it's pretty clear here that Cornelius is, quote unquote, the quarterback, and Flowers is just kind of in there to mix it up a little bit. But because we know he's going to have this unique role where he's going to both run with the football a little bit and throw some passes, there's some intriguing upside here as a running back on FanDuel.
I mean, we talk about running backs failing to have success so far. Why not get a guy that's basically a quarterback, even if he's playing a third of the snaps, as your running back on a 2-game slate on FanDuel? So something we'll have to keep an eye on for sure. But at his price, certainly intriguing upside there. All right, Dallas and Seattle, couple injuries here. Your boy Donald Parham exploded for us last week. He was fantastic. He's been limited in practice. He was actually in and out of that game, missing a couple snaps here and there, but he appears to be fine, limited practice. I mean, the head coach tagged him in a tweet on Twitter, so I think he's fine. But Seattle is where we have some interesting injuries. Dontez Bird, one of our air yards heroes, the Curtis Samuel, perhaps, of the XFL. He hasn't practiced through Wednesday with a knee injury. Casey Williams still hasn't practiced since before week 1, so he's likely out. And then Kenneth Farrow, part of their 3-headed attack in the backfield, he hasn't practiced through Wednesday with a rib injury, so things could get interesting here too.
Yeah, so big fan of coming up with some NFL comps for the people here on this podcast. I love that. I think what this really spells out on some Keenan Reynolds here for tournaments. I mean, he's still priced pretty affordably on both sites, and with all of these injuries to other skill position players on the Dragons, I mean, I don't see any reason why his production, his domination of the opportunity in the passing game for Seattle would dip at all. Dontez Bird is interesting. I mean, the knee injury that he has been dealing with that has kept him out of practice is probably, a big problem for sure, but he's still getting a ton of air yards on limited opportunities. So if he's active, I think he's someone that I'll be looking at as well. And then as far as the running game goes, they have been using all of Farrow, Trey Williams, and Jaquan Gardner pretty evenly in these first 2 weeks. So if Farrow is out, I think that does make each of Williams and Gardner a little more interesting for us as well.
Yeah, definitely, especially on the FanDuel 2-game slate where options are limited. But yeah, Farrow's out. He played the most snaps last week. He, Williams, and Gardner basically, I mean, they ran a ton in week 2, and they basically split touches like 11 to 12 each. So that would certainly be a sizable bump for both Gardner and Trey Williams. All right, ahead to Sunday's games, New York in St. Louis. Joe Horn, we mentioned, did not practice in their first practice of the week with that shoulder. Darius Victor left the game early with what appeared to be a concussion. He did not return. However, he's limited in practice. They think he's going to suit up. That would be interesting for that New York backfield. And in St. Louis, Matt Jones, once again, back to not practicing with his knee. All situations to monitor for DFS.
Yeah, when Victor left that game for New York, again, pitiful against the defenders in week 2. It did look like Tim Cook was the one who got basically all of the work out of the backfield for them. So if Victor is limited or out, I think Cook becomes an interesting tournament play, once again at a position where there just hasn't been a lot of production anyway, so it doesn't hurt to take some flyers. And then with, like these receivers, we already touched on this at the top of the show. I still think whether Horn's in or Horn's out, I'm having a hard time rationalizing playing any Guardian receiver other than McKay.
Yep.
And that's just kind of how I'm looking at it right now.
Cool. I agree with you there. And then on the St. Louis side, Matt Jones, again, we've already hit on this entire issue, but keep an eye on his practice participation throughout the week. Unless he makes a miraculous recovery or he's deemed fully healthy, both he or at least Christian Michael's in for a sizable role in week 3. All right, Chris, final 2 guys to talk about, both for LA against DC on Sunday in the primetime game. Running back Elijah Hood, limited with a knee. I guess he's fine. We'll find out here shortly. And then Saeed Blacknall, who missed last week's game, he's also back to a limited practice with his knee injury. Obviously, if Hood misses, it's a big deal. But if Blacknall misses again, do we have any opportunities maybe?
Yeah, so I think in week 2, I know in week 2 that both Jordan Smallwood and Adonis Jennings saw a decent amount of work. 6 targets for Smallwood, 5 for Jennings. Jennings had a ton of air yards. So, if Blacknall misses again, I think Jennings becomes an interesting play, a great pivot potentially off of Spruce, since, everybody at this point knows Spruce is pretty much the best receiver in the XFL. So, he'll be popular. A lot of people are going to want to use him. And I think the quality of play here with the Wildcats did look better with Josh Johnson under center. He is, they were trailing, so there's a reason for that, but he is pushing the ball downfield.
Yep.
He's a veteran professional quarterback that should be able to execute. So, eventually some of these other receivers for the Wildcats are going to make some plays. It can't possibly be Spruce every single week here. So, maybe it will, but I don't think we're going to have that opportunity if Blacknall goes. I think it's going to cut into this production for us.
Yeah, you're probably right. We'll see how Blacknall progresses here, but Adonis Jennings over 100 air yards in week 2.
Yeah, I will say that I just think we talked about this before the season started, looking at what Norm Chow has done past as defensive coordinator. He does seem to want to call more of a quote-unquote 50-50 split of run plays to pass plays. And so I think LA might be the type of team where if they get a lead, that they will be conservative. They'll try to run the football more. So this Hood injury is kind of interesting. If LA finds themselves beating the defenders here this weekend, might open up some opportunity for Larry Rose, who was the backup running back behind Hood, and he's actually been playing a little bit anyway.
Yep, exactly. And Hood, a dynamic pass catcher in college. So again, especially when the slates are so small, you have to keep an eye on every injury because every player could potentially impact the slate. So again, the guys we talked about here, when there are official updates, we'll either tweet them out, we'll put them in our daily plug, occupyfantasy.com. One more pitch for you there. It should be out Friday evening, the daily plug, XFL daily plug, so check that out, occupyfantasy.com. Our members have had great success. It's been fantastic. And again, not only do you get XFL, but coming up, spring training Saturday, very profitable. There are 3 keys to spring training, so go check out our website for those. I mean, people overlook if you play regular season MLB, this is a different beast for a variety of reasons. So be sure to check out our daily plug for that if you're a member. And then DFS Magic. We did get it up and running for Sunday's slate in week 2. It's fully functional for week 3. We have player values based on how we recommend them in the daily plug, so you can build up to 150 XFL DFS lineups for either FanDuel or DraftKings. All right, Chris, that'll do it. Any final thoughts? XFL through 2 weeks, week 3 predictions. What you got?
Well, I will just say having DFS Magic back up and running for this sport is definitely a big thing for members to focus on. I know we were looking at this and both kicking ourselves for not being sharp enough to do this. Had you played our top plays at each position in one lineup, it would have finished within that top 0.1% in week 2 in the big GPPs. So, keep that in mind between the 3 of us, you, me, and Lucas, putting our heads together and thinking about these slates. I think our rankings are pretty good. And now that you have the ability to optimize some lineups through DFS Magic, I really recommend everybody do that.
Hell of an endorsement, Chris. Appreciate that. It's very true. So go check it out, OccupyFantasy.com, DFSMagic.com. Remember, members of OccupyFantasy.com get free access, beta testing, DFS Magic. So go check that out. All right, so for Chris, I'm Brian. We appreciate you listening. Once again, click that subscribe button, whether it's in your podcast app or on YouTube. That way you get our latest videos and podcasts directly to your feed. OccupyFantasy.com. Last time. Give us a like, thumbs up, review if you like what we did here. We appreciate it. For Chris, I'm Brian. Thanks for listening. Good luck, and we'll talk to you soon.